Today's topic is the land and the people. And I'm going to talk in turn about the land, and then the people, and then the land and the people, specifically discuss the notion of a coming together, a uniting in a kind of marriage of the land and the people. And when I say the land and when I say the people, I'm talking conceptually, I'm talking sort of stereotypically, and mostly I'm talking symbolically. Um, and I'll say more about what I mean about that in a minute. But I am, of course, at the same time referring to concepts that have a real, tangible, sensory basis. I am talking about land on which you can stand and people who might stand on it. But to turn first to the land, the concept of the land, and you can hear that as having a big capital L, just as you will be able to hear people, or sometimes I might say the folk, as having a big capital P or a big capital F. The religions that we ascribe to the pagans, the pre-Christian peoples of Europe and Indo-Persian Asia, are sometimes referred to as cosmic religions. I'm not a big fan of that name because it seems to me to sound kind of science fictional. But when it's used, when that phrase cosmic religion is used by some historians of religion, what they're talking about is a religion that deals with the universe as seen by a local group, say a tribe, their understanding of the cosmos in a traditional way, defined by the relatively narrow world as they have experienced it through their own interactions with it, where they are, in a sense, at the center of the universe. And you can kind of contrast that with what we know today, having sent astronauts into outer space who've been able to look back at the Earth and even send us pictures of the world on which we live. We understand that wherever we might live, our local community is not really the center of the world. And the more the internet and other forms of mass communication unite us and connect us, I think the more and more profoundly and immediately and personally we understand that. But for the ancients, that wasn't the case. They may have assumed that the relatively small patch of earth and perhaps sea and lake that they experienced on a day-to-day, year-to-year basis was the cosmos. It was the universe. And they were at the center of it. And so their mythology, their religious practices, their customs, the manner in which they approached the various powerful entities that they perceived as being abroad in their universe, generally had to do with that immediate experienced cosmos in which they lived, their universe. Now, it's been suggested by any number of scholars working in any number of different disciplines that not just the Indo-European peoples, of whom the Celts were one, but perhaps peoples all over the world and down through many centuries, see the universe as not just extending, if you will, in the horizontal direction, not just in the realm of immediate experience in the sense I was just talking about, but that there is also similar, maybe even parallel, similarly structured realms above and below the world in which the people live. You can think of this in a certain sense as, to use a word that's kind of kicked around in science fiction a lot, a multiverse, that there are different sort of parallel realms above, below, and in the middle, which may have structures or geography that mirror each other and that connect in different ways, perhaps through a world tree, to use the Norse picture of the universe, where there's a central tree, at least this is what's represented in the mythology, which unites three worlds in the middle, three worlds above among the branches, and three other worlds down below among the roots of the tree. So there's an interesting kind of symmetry, but it's not a twofold symmetry. It's not the kind of symmetry we're accustomed to when we look at ourselves in the mirror and see two eyes, two ears, two arms, two legs, and so forth. But rather, it's an interesting threefold balance. So that's something to just think about, hang on to. The notion that for the Celts and their priesthood, the Druids, they would have seen the world in a couple of different ways. They would have understood the world as primarily consisting of that cosmos that they experienced, the land around them, and the special places in it, the ritual sites, the agricultural land, pastoral land, where the animals had to go year after year after year to graze and to have young. And then above and below that, there was probably some other parallel realm or realms. I'm going to focus primarily on the middle world, looking at it sort of as symbolically related to ideas about the structure of the human psyche. You can look at the lower world, for example, as mirroring the deep, unknowable, unconscious. The middle world is what embodies all the known sensory aspects of our experience. In Celtic tradition, the middle world also includes some places, I guess I should say, that are fantastical, that are literally thought of as otherworldly. One can travel around the middle world and enter into what some would call fairy, slip through a fog or go on a sea voyage and end up in some place that is different, that's inhabited by beings that are other than human or more special than human. Perhaps divine in some cases, but not always, but supernatural in some sense. So it can be understood that there are presences in the middle world, in the cosmos that we experience, that are other than us, and that we can perceive our world as in soul, that it contains spirit. I mean, this is essentially the animist perspective on the world in which we live, that trees and rocks and things of that sort are in fact inhabited by spirits of various sorts. So the middle world, our cosmos, is lively, and it is in a certain sense alive. Now, whether one wants to go so the so-called Gaia hypothesis, right, that the Earth itself has a unified consciousness, is up to anyone to decide for themselves. I don't think that that's the perspective that the ancient Celts would have taken. I think their perspective is one of discrete spirits or discrete intelligences or personalities that were abroad, particularly in certain powerful or mysterious places, but perhaps generally kind of all over the landscape. But the underlying important point, I think, is that it's possible to commune with non-human presences or powers or energies, however one wants to conceive of it, that are abroad in the land, that the land is in dialogue, or presences within the land are in dialogue, are in constant interaction with, in communication or communion, both with human beings. There are traditional ways of looking at the land and its structure. In modern Wiccan practice, it's very common to call the quarters in ritual, to address oneself to the four cardinal directions, east, south, west, and north, and to invoke certain kinds of energies or presences from those directions. We don't have clear evidence that the ancient Druids would have thought in those terms, that they considered there to be sort of discrete, different energies or attitudes abroad in the four cardinal directions. But it's pretty clear when you look at some of the manuscript evidence from Ireland, and particularly when you set it alongside, say, some of the Vedic Indian materials, that there is something important about the four directions. East has a certain kind of importance. One faces east in ancient Indo-European paganism when standing at the altar and invoking a beginning ritual. Typically, the attitude for the priest is to face east. You face other directions at certain times for certain purposes, but in general, the attitude, the basic orientation of the work is towards the east. And in the Irish language, for example, the word for south means essentially to the right or on the right hand, implying that the cardinal, the primary direction is the east. So at the very least, there is a sense that pagan ritual has a certain kind of preferred orientation that does set itself up on the land, oriented in a certain direction. But there are other clues. For the Vedic pagans of India, for example, the demonic entities, the adversarial entities, came from the south. There were gods, specific gods or goddesses, certainly gods anyway, that were associated with the four directions. In the Irish evidence, to get back more specifically to the Druidic context, in the Irish evidence, there is a manuscript, tract, called The Settling of the Manor at Tara, Tara being the seat of the Irish High Kings, that ascribes a whole laundry list of attributes to each of four provinces that were arrayed around the center. The western province, which was Connacht, was associated principally with learning. The Irish word is fis, F-I-S, I should say fish, F-I-S. It also, parts of the laundry list are foundations, teaching, judgment, stories, histories, science, all sort of related to learning, but also comeliness, beauty, modesty, but also bounty, abundance, wealth. So unlike what I suggested was a kind of common attitude in the Wiccan religion of associating one principal attribute, one primary kind of energy or rhythm or influence to each of the four directions, in this manuscript evidence, we see the Irish people having a whole sort of complex of attributes associated with a direction. Here's some of the laundry list for the north, for the province of Ulster. Principally, it's battle, and the Irish word there is cath, C-A-T-H. And some of the other attributes fall into line with that. Contentions, hardihood, rough places, strifes. But slightly differently, unprofitableness, hardness. In the east, the province of Leinster is primarily marked by the attribute of prosperity, which in Irish is blath, B-L-A-T-H. And some related words are in the list: supplies, wonders, good custom, abundance, wealth, householding, but also strength, accoutrements, good manners, related perhaps, but slightly different. In the south, in Munster, another of the provinces, interestingly, the primary attribute is music, or sheish, S-E-I-S, sheish. And here we find things like musicianship, melody, minstrelsy, music, but also wisdom, honor, advocacy, modesty, fertility, and even warriorship. So these aren't monolithic pictures of these cardinal directions, but they do suggest a different quality or characteristic to each of these directions. And overarching over all of this is a notion that they all come together and they all meet in a center that unites and in a certain sense directs them, that takes all of these subtly different attributes and blends them into one kind of coherent universal whole. And just to list the attributes of the so-called center, which was the province of Meath: kingship, dignity, primacy, establishments, warriorship, principality, a word oliveship, which an olive is essentially a professor, a master, bounty, fame, prosperity, renown. All of these are among a number of attributes that are listed as pertaining to the center of the cosmos, if you will, in this case, the island of Ireland. And you can look at that island of Ireland as self-contained. It's an interesting place because it was outside the Roman Empire, and so it managed to maintain its own kind of inherent cultural order, somewhat isolated, not totally isolated. We know there was trade with the Mediterranean, but they were never under Roman rule. They never participated in Roman provincial government, and so the island has a kind of an interesting, not to pun on it, insularity, and it can be seen as its own cosmos, as its own world. And it's a good example, to harken back to that initial concept of a cosmic religion. Here in this picture I've just provided from a medieval manuscript is a picture of Ireland as cosmos, divided into four directions, united by a center, which is something I'm actually going to come back to in a little bit more detail in a subsequent talk. Now, to stick with this image for a second, if Ireland is a whole, and within it there is a certain kind of order in which the people participate, and if the edges of the island in a certain sense are the boundary, then there is something outside. Most obviously that's the sea. And if we look at some of the myths that survive to us from ancient Ireland, linked to the sea, at least in some of the mythology, there is a race of beings who were adversaries of the gods and goddesses of the ancient Irish, a race of beings called the Fomorians, whose name may etymologically actually even relate to the sea. There's at least one folk etymology that suggests that the Fomorians' name implies undersea, under the sea. Fui actually in Irish does mean under. It's an adjective meaning under. Preposition, meaning under. And where can mean sea. So these were beings that in some descriptions and some of the mythic accounts were misshapen, had one eye, that sort of thing, marked out as different from the more perfected, from the sort of classical human appearance sense, gods and goddesses. But these beings had apparently the secrets of cultivation, fertility in the land. That even though they were opposed to the kind of social order of the gods and goddesses, they were primal beings in the sense that they had knowledge of, had the secrets of the fertility of the land itself. That when, to talk about one of the manuscripts specifically, when a war was concluded between the Irish gods and goddesses and these Fomorians, part of the treaty involved the passing on of the secrets of when to plant and when to reap. Now, I suppose that this all points to a kind of dichotomy or contention, or maybe continuum is a more productive notion, between the settled human order, the imposed, constructed order of human society, and the untamed, potentially fruitful land itself. And that maintaining a productive relationship with the land is about a constant tightrope walk, a constant dialogue, a constant negotiation between human sort of technological or at least agricultural activity and things like urbanization, which is nothing if not the creation of even more intense order, including the sort of geometric order of architecture, and again the untapped potential, sort of formless, untapped potential of the land. I've been reading Jared Diamond's book Collapse recently, which is interesting because it touches on this. I hadn't really thought to mention that in the context of this, but as I think about it, it is worth a read. I'd recommend it because it does sort of focus on precisely that issue, that societies can be their own worst enemies and they can choose to fail, and that they very often choose to fail by neglecting, in a certain sense, to listen to nature, to face up to the input that the natural world is providing back to human beings about the effects of their labors. And this, I think, is key to what I'm going to be talking about generally here, which is that human beings ought to remain part of the world, because they are, of course, animals like all other animals. They are part of their own local ecosystems and the environment of the world generally. And yet, all too often, human beings stand at the sort of antagonistic end of the continuum with nature. That human beings try to assert their will on the land to maximize kind of economic benefit, if you will, at the expense of often other creatures, often this potential fertility of land, and very often at the expense of their own interests without realizing it, unintentionally. So one of the pieces of wisdom, I suppose, that the ancients held, and I'm going to come back to sort of how this was embodied in some of the ritual practice in a little bit here, was that it was important to periodically renew consciously a contract between the people who were abiding on and working on and with the land, to renew the contract between the people and the land itself. And just to sort of foreshadow what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes here, that usually took the form of a sacred marriage. And specifically a sacred marriage between a kingly figure, a chieftain figure, sometimes a queen, but a noble figure who stood in as a representative of the entire population in sacred marriage to what was usually a goddess, often represented by an animal, usually a horse. A concept that I'm going to return to and talk about in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. The underlying notion here is that the land itself is sacred, that it is separate from people at the same time that people are a part of it, are inescapably linked to it. And that may just be a reflection of the fact that human beings have willpower and have choice and have the ability to decide how it is that they're going to impact on the land, that they can form whatever sort of relationship with the land they choose to. And that sets the land up as another party in the transaction, that we must be in conscious relationship with the land, and we must constantly be choosing how we act with the land. So the land is separate, which is essentially what the word sacred implies. Sacred, as I said in an earlier talk, refers to something that is set aside, that is for the divine, that is of the divine, that is set apart from humanity, and that in ritual time and in ritual space we confront it and we work with it and we make use of it. So the sacred in this case we can talk about as being the land. I'm going to turn to the concept of the people. I've been talking a lot about the people as dwelling on the land, being in dialogue with the land, in a sense in communion with the land or negotiation with the land, in conflict with the land. I just want to throw out some concepts. It's not specifically building on what I just was talking about, but just to put this out there as a matter of interest. Some concepts that the ancient Celts had of people as individuals, who they were and how they were constituted. There may be some fertile ideas in here that are different from the way we think of people today. There is a notion that human beings, and this isn't, I'm focusing on Irish concepts here, it's a notion that human beings are made up of various elements. That's a very loose translation of the Irish word, which is duile, D-U-I-L-E. Roughly, you can think of that as elements. There is at least one laundry list of these elements that relates them to parts of the body, and I've been given to understand also to things in the natural world. The elements of the body are seen as being the bones, the flesh, the hair, the blood, breath, the mind, the face, the brain, and the head. And it's been suggested that these correspond to a list of elements of the natural world, which would include, and I'll give you the Irish here as well as the English translations. First would be cloch, which means stone, talamh, which is earth, uinne, which is plant life, muir, which is the sea, gaith, which is wind, gealach, which is moon, grian, which is sun, nel, which is cloud, and Niev, which is heaven. So if one were to accept this proposed list of correspondences, the bones relate to the stone, the flesh to the earth itself, meaning the soil that covers those stones, the hair to the plant life, the blood to the sea, breath to wind, and then interestingly, mind to the moon, the face to the sun, the brain to the clouds, and the head ultimately to the heavens, to sort of heavenly sphere. So the body is made up of constituent parts that are not unlike the constituent pieces of the natural world. And there's a deeper correspondence then, because in a lot of traditional Indo-European thinking, which again includes the Celts, the universe was frequently seen as the remains of a dismembered primal divine being of some sort. Could be a god, sort of titan figure, but a primal being who was sacrificed or self-sacrificed and dismembered. And that out of the dismembered pieces of this primal being, we find the many separate, distinct pieces of the natural world. And so this resonates, I think, with this notion of the human being as composed of these constituent pieces that are in some kind of correspondence to the pieces of the elements of the natural environment. So the human being is, in some sense, a reflection of the natural world, which itself is, in many of these sort of Indo-European creation myths, the dismembered pieces, the separate pieces, separated constituent pieces of one being, one human-like being. So whatever our relationship is to the land, as collective people or as individuals, we have some kind of underlying, at very least symbolic, relationship to the land as sort of a mirror image, sort of reflection of the way the universe is built, that we ourselves are seen in some sense as like that. Just to throw out another concept that I think is really interesting and can be used by us moderns in thinking about ourselves and about wholeness. Another concept that the ancient Irish had in looking at the human being and what the internal energies of the human being were three cauldrons. There's a tract which is usually called the Cauldron of Poesy, which argues for three cauldrons inside the human being. That there is a cauldron of making, a cauldron of vocation, and a cauldron of knowledge. And that these were respectively sort of in the belly, in the heart, and in the head. And that in every person, this first cauldron in the belly started out upright, meaning that it contained some sort of perhaps water, heated water, water of incubation and energy. Then the next cauldron in most people starts out on its side, so it's only capable of being partly filled before the stuff that's put in it will spill out. And that last cauldron, specifically the cauldron of knowledge, thought to be centered in the head, starts out upside down, so it will receive nothing. And that the task of the human being is to successively turn upright and fill the second and then the third completely inverted cauldron. And so the getting of wisdom, ultimately, the coming into fullness and balance of the human being, the being replete with whatever it is that fills these cauldrons, kind of fiery water perhaps, to stick with the basic image, is about finding vocation, finding a path through life to bring upright the second cauldron and begin to fill it. And then as one progresses through life, to progressively turn upright the cauldron of knowledge and fill it with content. One last important concept about people that one finds not just in Ireland but in other places like Wales, other Celtic lands, into quite recent history, is that individuals have something that's usually translated as an honor price. That depending on what place they fill, in a certain sense, in the community, they are entitled to a certain level of restitution if they're injured. The king, which I suppose one could just as easily think of as a chieftain in the traditional Celtic context, has the highest honor price because they fill the most central, unifying place in the community, the place in the community that touches the most lives, and therefore if they were killed or maimed or otherwise rendered incapable, the most people are going to be affected by that. And sort of on down through the honored poets, and so on down among the artisans and into the sort of non-landholding peoples of the community. Now this seems to me to fly in the face of what we modern North Americans think of as a basic need to be egalitarian. And I think that's one of the happy legacies of the Enlightenment, the kind of humanistic attitude that all people have an essential worth. But it's interesting because one can go so far if one sort of says all people are always equal under all circumstances just because they're people. then we end up on a slippery slope where somebody who is, endlessly philanthropic, or a scientist and healer who, invents vaccines that save hundreds, if not thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives, is just the same and deserves the same amount of accord as, somebody who robs and rapes the innocent. So it seems to me, got to be some kind of a dialogue between complete egalitarianism, an attitude of complete equality of all human beings under all circumstances by virtue of their merely being human, and the pragmatic, practical recognition that human society is not composed of people who all contribute equally, and that if one were to, in the modern context, shoot the president, one is going to have a greater impact on society than if one were to kill a mugger in self-defense. And I'm going to leave that concept for the moment because I'm actually going to come back to it at the end. But it's worth noting that the people, to return to that word that I'm going to use repeatedly, the people were not an undifferentiated mass. That in these traditional societies, the societies in which the ancient Druids operated, the people resided within a fairly elaborate social architecture, multi-layered, multi-tiered architecture, and that one supposes they saw the society of the gods and goddesses as being reflective of that and being similarly structured. These traditional cultures that I'm talking about, these traditional societies, I should say, were organized around what are generally called clans these days. There are arguments I've seen as to whether that's an appropriate word to use. Clan, tribe. Anthropologists use those words differently in different contexts. And confusing things further, of course, the traditional Highland cultures of Scotland use the word clan to refer to a certain grouping of families under a chieftain. But these ancient societies were focused, in the sense that I've been talking about this sort of tiered structure. You could think of it perhaps as a caste structure. We're focused in a sort of pyramidal structure that pointed to some sort of chieftain. And there is a word in Irish, ri, R-I, that refers to king. That's how it's usually translated, because it's related to other words like rex for king, or rig, R-I-G, the word for king in Sanskrit. So there is a kind of, in addition to looking at it as sort of a pyramid with the chieftain or king, if you will, at the top, it's also a sort of radiating circles with various productive members of the community, agriculturalists, landowners, pastoralists, and so on, artisans of various sorts, various nobles who kind of brought order to and provided defense to, or organized the defense of the community on behalf of this retinue of people in their surrounding community. And above all, again, as I say, the chieftain, this king figure. There were elaborate systems of fosterage, allowing people to move into different kin groups. There was an elaborate legal system that allowed for shared accountability and shared responsibility and shared benefit when there were issues at law, where people who were even somewhat distantly related to each other shared in accountability, shared in restitution if restitution was made. So there was an elaborate, interconnected society that was locally focused, and as I say, multi-tiered, and ultimately had one person, as so many societies do, in primary leadership. That figure, who we can just call the king for convenience sake, although it's probably closer, as I say, anthropologically speaking, to a chieftain, had tremendous traditional and even mythological importance. Both the myths and, in a certain sense, even some of the folk traditions and legal traditions suggest to us that the king was idealized. The king was, at least in theory, meant to be unblemished. And in the mythology, a king could be was removed from the throne. The king of the gods, Neo-Pagan in one myth, is removed from the throne because his hand is severed in battle. And being no longer whole, no longer unblemished, he can no longer sit on the throne. In reality, in the human world, as opposed to the world of the gods and goddesses, that was probably not enforced literally. But more than just figuratively, more than just symbolically, the king was supposed to embody certain ideals. There is, and I talked about this in a previous talk, a concept of a truth of the king. I think the Old Irish is fear flaha, which refers to a kind of noble truth, a kind of propriety that the king is supposed to embody. And that as the king practices this kind of right living, as the king embodies propriety, honor, honorableness, prosperity then flows to the people. And this is supported by a relationship between the king and a principal poet figure. May have been a druid in the pre-Christian era, but within the Christian era, we find down through the centuries in Celtic lands this interesting side-by-side relationship of this king figure and an important court bard, somebody who was responsible for eulogies, perhaps for reciting genealogies, and certainly for composing and reciting praise poetry, for praising, recognizing, and extolling the honorableness of the chieftain, of the king figure. There has been speculation that these two figures, the king and the poet, were seen in a certain sense as married. Maybe not literally, but at least figuratively, were seen as in some kind of bond that was analogous to the bonds of matrimony. Some of the poetry is redolent of a kind of homosexual imagery. This doesn't necessarily imply that there was literally a homosexual relationship between these two individuals, but the imagery does suggest a relationship akin to marriage. Now I'm going to talk in just a second here a bit more about the ideology of the sacred marriage with the land, and it's possible that this relationship between the king and the poet is an analog to that, and that the poet stands in for the land, specifically stands in for the goddess in the land to whom the king was meant to be married. So here we have a land peopled by many spirits, by many beings, composed of many constituent elements, that is fertile, that is replete with potential. And we have a people organized in ancient Celtic context in a sort of stratified social architecture, headed up by various nobles, above all of them the Ree, the king, who have the ability to mobilize this social structure into manifesting the potential of the land. But behind it all, as I say, there is the possibility always, and we see this more and more these days, and again I reference the Jared Diamond book, Collapse, There is the potential for conflict. There is the potential for the people to not be maximizing the relationship, the harmonious relationship with the land. There is the possibility that the people will be acting foolishly, will be acting as poor stewards of the potential of the land. And so ritually, it seems, whether this was a conscious act or an intuitive gesture, ritual gesture that survived down through the centuries, not just among the Celts, but elsewhere, notably in ancient India, the ruler was put through a ritual marriage to the sovereignty goddess, to the embodiment of the cosmos. Thinking again of the cosmos as the local universe, the world that the local people knew, that the tribe knew and experienced. That summing up, just as the king summed up the people and embodied the most perfect ideals of the people, at least in an ideal sense, so too the sovereignty goddess was seen as the embodiment of the land, the instantiation, the personification of the land. And this is not necessarily to say, by the way, and somewhat parenthetically, that the sovereignty goddess, any sovereignty goddess in this context, was seen as a kind of Mother Earth figure who was the entirety of all of the planet. We know, for example, that there were at least 3 names for a goddess who embodied Ireland. And that it wasn't just one goddess. They were seen as 3 separate goddesses who were encountered serially as the human beings came into Ireland and ultimately displaced the gods who were living in the land. They initially encountered one, then another, and then a third goddess whose name was equivalent to Ireland. One was Banba, one was Fola, and the third and ultimately most important was Eriu. And it was Eriu whose name ultimately survived, because it was she who struck the most agreeable bargain with the new settlers, with the human beings who were coming in to settle Ireland. And so Banba's name and Fola's name, it was said, would be names for Ireland in times to come. But Eriu's name, which gives us Erin and Era, would become the name for Ireland. So it's not, as I say, a notion of one unitary goddess of all of creation, but a goddess who represented the land in which the people lived. And also, maybe less parenthetically, sometimes goddesses would be linked to rivers. And I think it's fair to say that as people migrated, they might follow rivers and therefore be following and venerating in their travels one goddess linked to the river. But one supposes that when you traveled from one river to another, there would be a different goddess residing in that river. And we have notions of the names of and attributes of some of these goddesses. But to take the people as residing where they're residing and working with at least one important image of a goddess in the land, there would then be undertaken a sacred marriage. There would then be undertaken a ritual occasion, and this, as I say, we see at least in India as well as in Ireland, as widely separated geographically as those lands were, wherein there was the sacrifice of a horse, an animal which is very deeply and anciently linked to a sovereignty goddess. And as part of the ritual sacrifice of this horse, there would be, and we have different narratives about these different rituals in different places, either a figurative or perhaps maybe even a literal joining together of ruler and beast. A Welsh writer, Gerald of Wales, writing in the Middle Ages, was rather horrified to go into the hinterlands of Ireland and discover one of these inauguration rituals taking place where, at least as he described it, there was actual copulation between the ruler and the horse. We don't know whether that really was true and whether Gerald was just impugning the Irish as barbarians. but it's been much remarked upon because that ritual that Gerald of Wales was describing in, I think it's the 12th century, is remarkably similar to an Vedic Indian inauguration ritual from over 1,000 years earlier in any number of details, most particularly the union of the ruler with a horse. It's too strong to say they're identical, but they're remarkably similar. This relationship between the ruler and the land is deep-seated in Celtic lore. And I always want to point people to the Arthurian canon and the notion of the wounded king and the wasteland that you find in the Arthurian mythos. And that relates to a myth that I already mentioned in passing of Nuada, the king of the Irish gods, who lost his throne when his hand was severed and was able to reclaim the throne when it was replaced. There's such a strong resonance with Arthur's wound to, usually it's the thigh, but there's a notion of emasculation involved in there, that the king is no longer whole, and because the king is no longer whole, the land can no longer be whole, the people will no longer prosper. This is a very potent image, a very powerful one. And again, I would stress the notion of the ruler, the king figure, the fit representative, the fit, honorable representative of the people, standing in a one-to-one sacred marriage relationship with the embodiment of the land and the figure of the sovereignty goddess. And that figure, the sovereignty goddess, again, sort of parenthetically, remains a really compelling and important and vital one in the literary context, particularly in Ireland. The figure of the old woman who's often called Kathleen Ní Houlihan in Irish literature, who is the old woman of the perhaps familiar song The Four Green Fields, is the embodiment of Ireland. And she's not just a modern literary version of this ancient sovereignty figure. We find her in an early poem, the Cailleach Beara, the old woman or hag or crone of Beara, who is lamenting her fate and is clearly a sovereignty goddess, a land goddess, goddess of the land itself, the stony parts of southwest Ireland in this case. Just to tie things together and come back to what I was talking about earlier, just for a moment, about the attributes of the four horizons, of the horizontal landscape of the middle world in which we live. I suggested in my talk on constructing the nematon that in ritual often one is seeking to find the center of the universe, the center of the cosmos, and do sacred activity there, to mark out the temple or the ritual site as being somehow the center of the cosmos. And the historian of religion, Mircea Eliade, talks about that at length in his books, that's a preeminent ritual activities to try to be as the gods are by being at the center of the universe. That if one recreates the universe in ritual, one is doing as the gods did. And if there is a center to the land, and the people can situate their king, their fit representative, their idealized representative at the center, then the people are, in another way, in addition to this sacred marriage, asserting their harmonious relationship with the land, that the order of the people is, to use a big word, contiguous with the architecture of the land itself. So to the extent that ideology is part of the thinking and the ritual traditions of the people, a focus on a sacred center in Ireland it was the Hill of Tara, seat of the High King, that was also seen in the mythology as the seat of the gods and goddesses, then again, the people are reminding themselves continually of their relationship with the land and asserting it as a parallel and hopefully harmonious one.